November 3, 1944, 32,000 feet above Tokyo. Captain Robert Truelove of the 3rd Photographic Reconnaissance Squadron watched through his camera port as something impossibly fast streaked past his unarmed F-13 Superfortress. The object, sleek, orange-striped, trailing white vapor, accelerated vertically at a rate no aircraft should achieve. Then it exploded. Not from enemy fire, just exploded. Spontaneously, violently, scattering burning fragments across 6,000 feet of altitude. Truelove keyed his radio. Did anyone else see that? His navigator, Lieutenant James Morrison, was already checking his stopwatch. 37 seconds from launch to detonation. Whatever it was, it killed itself. What neither man knew, what American intelligence wouldn't fully understand for another 6 months, was that they had just witnessed the operational debut of Japan's most ambitious technological gamble, a weapon system that cost more than Japan's entire naval aviation program for 1944, a program that consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere, a marvel of engineering that would kill more Japanese than Americans. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, cherry blossom. The Americans would call it baka, idiot. It was supposed to be the weapon that would turn the tide. Instead, it became the most spectacular failure in the history of aerial warfare. Not because it didn't work, but because it worked exactly as designed, revealing in the process every fatal flaw in Japan's understanding of modern war. This is the story of how desperation, technical brilliance, and catastrophic strategic blindness combined to create a weapon that embarrassed its creators on the world stage. How Japanese engineers built a rocket-powered suicide missile that was too fast to aim, too fragile to survive, and too expensive to waste. How American fighter pilots discovered they didn't need to shoot it down, they just had to wait. The mathematics of humiliation were built into the airframe from the beginning. But in September 1944, standing in the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal Design Bureau, Ensign Mitsuo Ota believed he was looking at salvation. The Oka program emerged from the same calculations that produced kamikaze tactics, the realization that Japan was losing the war of attrition so completely that only radical asymmetry could change the outcome. By mid-1944, conventional attacks against American warships required dozens of aircraft to achieve a single hit. The loss rates were unsustainable. Japan was losing pilots faster than it could train them, losing aircraft faster than it could build them. Ota's proposal was elegant in its brutality. Eliminate the return flight. Eliminate defensive armament. Eliminate everything except propulsion, warhead, and just enough control surfaces to aim. Create a manned missile that could guarantee hits through human guidance in the final seconds. A 2,600-pound warhead traveling at 650 miles per hour, immune to defensive fire through sheer speed. The Imperial Japanese Navy approved the program in August 1944. Priority absolute. Resources unlimited. Timeline immediate. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, personally guaranteed production support. 1 hit, he told the design team, will sink a carrier. 10 hits will change the war. The engineering was impressive. The Oka Model 11, the first production variant, measured just 19.8 feet long with a 16.4-foot wingspan. Empty weight, 970 pounds. Loaded weight, 4,718 pounds. The warhead alone weighed 2,645 pounds, packed with Type 97 explosives more powerful than standard torpedoes. 3 Type 4 Mark I Model 20 solid-fuel rockets, each producing 1,764 pounds of thrust for 8 to 10 seconds, provided terminal velocity acceleration. The cockpit was barely large enough for a pilot. No ejection system, no parachute. The instrument panel contained an airspeed indicator, altimeter, turn coordinator, and dive angle indicator. Nothing else was needed. The control surfaces, ailerons, and elevators were oversized for the airframe, allowing sharp maneuvers during the final dive. Wind tunnel testing at the Yokosuka facility confirmed the aerodynamics were sound. Launch procedure was simple. A Mitsubishi G4M2E Betty bomber, specially modified with reinforced hardpoints, would carry the Oka suspended beneath its fuselage. At altitude typically 27,000 feet and 50 miles from the target, the mothership would release the weapon. The Oka would glide toward the target at 230 miles per hour, trading altitude for distance. When visual contact was established, typically at 3 miles, the pilot would ignite the rockets. In the 10 seconds of powered flight that followed, the Oka would accelerate to 650 miles per hour while diving at angles up to 50 degrees. At that speed and angle, the closing rate on a target was over 600 feet per second. American gunners would have less than 5 seconds to track, aim, and fire. The probability calculations suggested that 70% of launched Oka would hit their targets. On paper, it was devastating. In practice, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The first hint of trouble came during testing. On October 31, 1944, at Kashima Naval Air Base, Lieutenant Junior Grade Taro Hayashi climbed into Oka No. 7 for the first manned rocket-powered flight. The Betty mothership released him at 23,000 feet over Sagami Bay. Hayashi descended in the prescribed glide, stabilized at 3,000 feet, and ignited the rockets. The acceleration was violent. Hayashi's flight recorder, recovered from the wreckage, showed he experienced 9 G-forces in the first second. The wings flexed alarmingly. The control surfaces stiffened as aerodynamic pressure increased. At maximum velocity, 620 miles per hour indicated, Hayashi attempted a gentle turn to align with the target barge. The Oka rolled inverted and entered a flat spin. At that speed, recovery was impossible. The airframe broke apart at 1,200 feet. Hayashi's body was found 3 miles from the main wreckage. The recorder stopped at 637 miles per hour. The investigation revealed fundamental problems. The Oka's aerodynamic design, optimized for stability in the glide phase, became dangerously unstable at rocket-powered speeds. Control surface effectiveness was marginal above 500 miles per hour. The pilot experienced such extreme G-forces during powered flight that precise aim was nearly impossible, and the structural margins were thinner than calculated. Several test airframes had shown stress cracks after just one flight. The naval arsenal made modifications. They reinforced the wing spars, reduced the rocket burn time from 10 seconds to 8, installed a crude G-force limiter that prevented elevator deflection beyond 30 degrees. The fixes helped, somewhat, but they couldn't solve the core problem. The Oka was almost uncontrollable at the speeds necessary to defeat American defenses. Despite these issues, production accelerated. By January 1945, the Yokosuka arsenal and 6 subcontractors were producing 50 Oka per month. The total program cost remains classified, but partial records suggest it exceeded 200 million yen, equivalent to building 400 Zero fighters. Each Oka costs approximately 650,000 yen to produce. Each costs 250,000 yen. Training the pilots was equally expensive. The Navy established the 721st Naval Air Group specifically for Oka operations. Pilots underwent 3 weeks of intensive training. Week 1 covered glide characteristics using unpowered prototypes. Week 2 introduced powered flight, if rockets were available, which they increasingly weren't due to production bottlenecks. Week 3 focused on target approach and final dive techniques. The survival rate during training was 73%. 27% of pilots died before ever facing the enemy, some from equipment failure, some from pilot error, some from simple physics. Learning to control an aircraft that accelerated from 230 to 600 miles per hour in 8 seconds required reflexes that many pilots simply didn't possess. Ensign Saburo Dohi, one of the first volunteer pilots, described his training in a letter to his family dated February 3, 1945. The Oka is a magnificent weapon, but it is also a temperamental beast. The glide is peaceful, almost meditative. Then you ignite the rockets, and suddenly you are riding a lightning bolt. Everything happens too fast for thought. You must act on pure instinct. Your vision narrows, your hands feel like they weigh 100 pounds. And then, if you are fortunate and skilled, you see the target grow large in your sight. That is the moment of transcendence. Dohi died 6 days later when his Oka's rockets ignited prematurely during a training flight. The explosion was visible from the base tower. By March 1945, the 721st Naval Air Group had 55 trained pilots and 200 operational Oka. Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, ordered immediate deployment to Kanoya Air Base in southern Kyushu. The target, American carriers supporting the invasion of Okinawa. The first operational mission launched on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M-2E Betty bombers, each carrying one Oka, took off from Kanoya at 0600 hours. The mission commander, Captain Motoharu Okamura, led the formation toward the American fleet operating 350 miles southeast of Kyushu. Escorting the Bettys were 30 Zero fighters, every operational fighter 5th Air Fleet could spare. The formation was detected by radar from the destroyer USS Coswell at 0725 hours, 110 miles from the fleet. Combat Air Patrol, 6 F-6 F-5 Hellcats from USS Hornet were vectored to intercept. They made contact at 0738 hours, 85 miles from the fleet. What followed was not combat, it was slaughter. The Betty bombers loaded with Oka couldn't maneuver. The massive weight, nearly 5,000 pounds suspended beneath each aircraft, made evasive action impossible. Maximum speed with the burden, 195 miles per hour. The Hellcats, capable of 380 miles per hour, had a 100 mile per hour advantage. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia, leading the Hellcat Division, described the engagement in his combat report. Target aircraft were flying straight and level, making no attempt at evasion. We executed stern attacks from a stern quarter high. First burst into lead aircraft produced immediate fire in starboard engine. Target continued flying for approximately 10 seconds before external store separated and aircraft entered vertical dive. Target exploded on water impact. Repeated for remaining targets. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. All 18 Betty bombers were destroyed. Not a single Oka reached launch range. The escorting Zeros, facing 3-to-1 odds after additional Hellcats arrived, lost 9 aircraft. No American planes were lost. Captain Okamura died when his aircraft, hit by .50 caliber fire, exploded before he could jettison the Oka. Survivors reported seeing at least 3 Betty crews attempt to jettison their weapons early, but the emergency release mechanism, designed to be fail-safe, failed under combat conditions. The pilots died still carrying their weapons. The disaster prompted immediate tactical revision. Future missions would release Oka at maximum possible range, 60 miles from target, accepting lower hit probability in exchange for survival of the motherships. The Navy also ordered development of longer-range Oka variants that could be launched from even farther away. But the core problem remained unsolved. The Betty bombers couldn't survive long enough to reach launch range against alert American defenses. The second major attack came on April 1, 1945, the day of the American landing on Okinawa. The plan was ambitious. 50 Betty bombers carrying Oka, supported by 100 conventional attack aircraft, and 80 fighters would strike the invasion fleet at dawn. The Navy committed every available Oka and pilot. Vice Admiral Ugaki called it the decisive blow. The formation began launching at 0430 hours. Assembly took nearly an hour. Coordinating that many aircraft in darkness was extraordinarily difficult. By the time the last Betty joined the formation, American radar had been tracking them for 35 minutes. Combat Air Patrol was already positioning for intercept. The Americans had learned from March 21st. Instead of engaging over water, where damaged Japanese aircraft might still reach launch range, The Hellcats hit the formation 120 miles from the fleet, before the Bettys could begin their approach runs. This time they had overwhelming numbers. 55 fighters from 5 carriers descended on the Japanese formation like wolves on sheep. Lieutenant John Jack Kitchen, flying an F-6F-5 from USS Belleau Wood, described what he saw. The Japanese bombers were carrying something large under the fuselage, made them look pregnant, made them fly like pregnant cows too. They couldn't maneuver at all. We'd come in from above and behind, put a burst into the engines, and they'd just fold up. Some of them tried to jettison their loads, but the things didn't fall clean. A couple of them hit the tail on separation, and the whole airplane just came apart. In 22 minutes of combat, 42 Betty bombers were destroyed. 8 more were so badly damaged they crashed on return to base. Of the entire 50-aircraft Oka strike force, 0 reached launch range. 26 escort fighters were also lost. American losses: 3 Hellcats damaged, none destroyed. Not a single Oka was launched. The humiliation was complete. Japan had committed its secret weapon, its technological ace, its suicide missile core, and achieved nothing. Worse, the weapon system's fundamental vulnerability was now apparent to everyone. The Bettys couldn't survive. The Oka couldn't launch. The entire concept was fatally flawed. But the Navy had invested too much to abandon the program. Production continued, training continued. More pilots volunteered, knowing the odds, and the attacks continued, each one ending in disaster. April 12th. 15 Oka-carrying Bettys attempted to attack ships off Okinawa. 11 were shot down before launch. 4 reached release range, but launched into clouds, losing sight of targets. All 4 Oka crashed into the ocean without hitting anything. No American ships damaged. April 16th. 8 Bettys with Oka attacked at dusk, hoping darkness would provide cover. American radar-directed night fighters intercepted 40 miles from the fleet. 7 Bettys destroyed. 1 reached launch range and released its Oka at the destroyer USS Manert L. Able from 12 miles away, double the recommended range. The Oka pilot, unable to spot his target through the gathering darkness, aimed at what he thought was a battleship. It was a water plume from an earlier bomb hit. The Oka impacted the ocean at 600 miles per hour, detonating harmlessly 200 yards from any ship. April 28th. The 721st Naval Air Group committed its remaining 12 Oka in a final desperate attack. The plan called for launch at maximum range, 65 miles, accepting that pilots would be navigating blind for the glide phase, hoping to spot targets before igniting rockets. It was a terrible plan. They launched anyway. American Combat Air Patrol intercepted 90 miles from the fleet. 10 Bettys were destroyed immediately. The remaining 2, damaged but flying, reached launch range. Both jettisoned their Oka. Both weapons fell away cleanly. Both entered their glide toward the American fleet. Seaman First Class Robert Carnes, stationed on the destroyer USS Wadsworth, was the first American sailor to see an Oka in flight. This orange thing came out of the clouds, maybe 5,000 feet up, gliding like a hawk, no sound, just this sleek little airplane without propellers. It was weirdly beautiful. Then it lit up like a firework. The rockets ignited and suddenly it was screaming down, trailing smoke, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Faster than a diving plane, faster than a shell, just insanely fast. The Oka pilot, likely disoriented from the violent acceleration and unable to properly identify targets through the G-force-induced tunnel vision, aimed at the largest silhouette he could see. USS Wadsworth, a 2,200-ton destroyer, presented a small target. The pilot missed. The Oka passed 50 feet off the port bow, so fast that only 3 gunners even fired at it, all missing. The weapon impacted the ocean at an oblique angle, skipped once, and exploded 200 yards from any ship. The concussion was violent enough to crack Wadsworth's fire control radar mount. The second Oka never ignited its rockets. Either the pilot was killed during the approach or the rocket system malfunctioned. The weapon glided for 8 miles before running out of altitude and crashing into the sea 6 miles from the nearest ship. By the end of April 1945, the Oka program had launched 74 weapons in combat. Results: 0 ships sunk, 0 ships damaged, 0 hits of any kind. Japanese losses: 52 Betty bombers destroyed, 156 aircrew killed, 74 Oka pilots killed, 39 escort fighters destroyed, 39 fighter pilots killed. The most expensive military failure of Japan's war effort had achieved nothing except demonstrating to the world that Japan's vaunted technological prowess was a hollow boast. American intelligence was fascinated. When intact Oka wreckage was recovered from shallow water off Okinawa on May 2, 1945, Naval Technical Intelligence teams immediately shipped it to the United States for analysis. The engineers were surprised, not by the crude construction, they'd expected that for a weapon designed to be used once, but by how unnecessarily sophisticated certain components were. The rocket motors used a propellant formula more advanced than anything in American service. The explosive filler was more powerful than standard torpedoes. The control surfaces incorporated ball-bearing assemblies machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, absurd precision for a suicide weapon. Someone had clearly invested enormous resources into making the Oka technically impressive, apparently not considering whether technical sophistication mattered when the weapon couldn't reach its target. The analysis report, declassified in 1958, was brutally frank. The MXY-7 Oka represents a significant engineering achievement in miniaturization and propulsion. However, the operational concept is fundamentally flawed. The delivery system, G4M bomber, lacks the speed and defensive capability to survive in contested airspace. The weapon's extreme terminal velocity makes aimed attacks extremely difficult. The lack of target discrimination capability means most launches will result in misses, even against large ships. Assessment: this weapon system demonstrates desperation, not innovation. But the analysts missed something crucial. The Oka's greatest failure wasn't tactical, it was strategic. Every resource devoted to the program was a resource not available for conventional defense. Every hour of skilled labor building Oka was an hour not building fighters. Every pilot volunteering for the 721st Naval Air Group was one fewer pilot defending Japanese cities from B-29 raids. By May 1945, Japan had produced approximately 850 Oka of all variants. At 650,000 yen each, that was 552 million yen, enough to build 2,200 Zero fighters at 250,000 yen each. The Navy had essentially traded 2,200 conventional fighters for a weapon system that had sunk exactly 0 enemy ships. The industrial cost went beyond direct production. The Type 4 rockets required specialized facilities to manufacture the solid fuel propellant. These facilities could have produced aviation gasoline, which Japan desperately needed. The Type 97 explosives required for the warheads consumed industrial chemicals needed for conventional bomb production. The specialized factories producing Oka airframes could have been retooled for standard aircraft production in a fraction of the time. Worse was the opportunity cost in pilot training. The 721st Naval Air Group consumed instructors, fuel, and training aircraft that could have produced 3 times as many conventionally trained pilots. By April 1945, Japan was so desperate for fighter pilots that teenagers with less than 50 hours of flight time were being sent into combat. Meanwhile, experienced instructors were teaching elite volunteers how to fly a weapon that couldn't survive long enough to be used. The program's defenders argued that conventional tactics had failed, that only radical solutions could change the war's trajectory. But the Oka wasn't a solution, it was a confession of defeat, dressed up as innovation. It was Japan saying, "We can't win through fighting, so we'll win through dying." Except dying without effect is just dying. The weapon's psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. When news of the April 1st failure spread through naval aviation units, morale collapsed. Pilots who had viewed kamikaze tactics as an honorable sacrifice now saw them as a waste. The Oka, which was supposed to make suicide attacks effective, had instead demonstrated their futility. If even a purpose-built suicide weapon couldn't get through American defenses, what hope did conventional aircraft have? Vice Admiral Ugaki, in his diary entry for April 2, 1945, wrote, "The Oka attack failed. All our preparations, all our hopes resulted in nothing. The Americans shot down our motherships before the weapon could even be used. I have ordered the program to continue, but in my heart I know it is finished. We built a sword that cannot reach the enemy. What use is the sharpest blade that cannot strike?" But the Navy pressed forward with more advanced variants. The Model 22, designed to be launched from faster Yokosuka PY-1 France's bombers, entered limited production in May 1945. The Model 33, with a jet engine instead of rockets, was supposed to have 3 times the range. The Model 43, launched from submarines, was supposed to eliminate the vulnerable mothership problem. None of these variants saw combat. The Model 22 suffered from the same fundamental problem. The Francis bomber, while faster than the Betty, still couldn't survive against American fighters. The Model 33's jet engine proved too unreliable for production. The Model 43 was still in development when the war ended. But the April 28th attack, the one where Seaman Carnes watched an Oka scream past USS Wadsworth, wasn't the program's final act. There was one more mission, one more disaster, one more humiliation. May 11, 1945. By this point, the 721st Naval Air Group had been decimated. Of the original 200 pilots, fewer than 40 remained. Aircraft were scarce, only 7 Betty bombers were operational. But Vice Admiral Ugaki ordered one final attack, not because he believed it would succeed, because doing nothing was unacceptable, because surrender without one more attempt was unthinkable. 7 Betty bombers carrying Oka took off from Kanoa at 0545 hours. No escorts, there were no fighters to spare. The plan was simple to the point of suicide: fly low over the water to avoid radar detection, climb to launch altitude 30 miles from the fleet, release Oka, and pray. They were detected anyway. Radar picket destroyers spotted the low-flying formation 75 miles from the fleet. Combat Air Patrol was vectored to intercept. 16 Hellcats dropped from 15,000 feet like stones. The Betty crews never had a chance. Flying at wave-top height to avoid radar, they had no room to maneuver when the Hellcats attacked from above. The Americans executed rolling attacks, diving through the formation, firing, zooming back to altitude, and diving again. It was target practice. 6 Betty bombers were destroyed in the first 2 minutes. The 7th, piloted by Lieutenant Kunio Kanzaki, managed to jink violently enough to throw off the first attack. His aircraft took hits but stayed airborne. His co-pilot was killed. His radio operator was killed. The Oka pilot, Ensign Yoshiro Tsubaki, trapped in his tiny cockpit inside the suicide weapon still attached to the bomber's belly, could do nothing but wait. Kanzaki, wounded and flying a dying aircraft, did something extraordinary. Instead of turning back, he climbed. Not to launch altitude, he knew he'd never make it, but to 3,000 feet, just high enough for the Oka to have a glide range of a few miles. He released the weapon. Tsubaki found himself falling in his rocket-powered coffin not toward an enemy fleet, but to the empty ocean. The Betty's altitude was insufficient for a proper glide to the target. The nearest American ship was 40 miles away. But Tsubaki had trained for this moment for 3 months. He had volunteered, knowing he would die. And now, falling through the morning sky with no possibility of hitting anything except water, he faced a choice: ignite the rockets and die quickly in a purposeless explosion, or ride the glide until impact and die slowly, pointlessly, having achieved nothing. He ignited the rockets. The Oka accelerated to 580 miles per hour in 7 seconds. Tsubaki, experiencing 8 G-forces, probably lost consciousness almost immediately. The weapon traveled 2.3 miles in powered flight before exhausting its fuel. Then it continued on a ballistic trajectory for another 4 miles, descending through 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet, and finally impacting the ocean at a shallow angle. The 2,645-pound warhead exploded on contact with the water. The detonation created a plume 200 feet high, visible from the American ships 35 miles away. Seamen on the destroyer USS Evans commented that it looked like a depth charge had gone off. They logged it as a possible submarine attack and dropped depth charges in the area for the next hour, never knowing they were bombing the debris field of Japan's failed superweapon. Lieutenant Kanzaki's Betty, riddled with holes and trailing smoke, continued flying for another 3 minutes before the port engine exploded. The aircraft entered a flat spin and impacted the ocean vertically. There were no survivors. That was the last operational launch of an Oka in World War II. The program's final tally: 74 weapons launched in combat, 0 hits, 0 ships damaged, 0 ships sunk. Over 300 Japanese personnel were killed while delivering the weapon to the launch range. Over 850 Oka were built at a catastrophic cost, and perhaps most damning, 0 American casualties directly attributable to the weapon itself. The Americans, fascinated by captured examples, conducted extensive testing after the war. In August 1945, the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland, received 2 intact Oka for evaluation. Test pilots were eager to fly it, expecting something impressively dangerous. They were disappointed. Commander Frederick Trapnell, the Navy's chief test pilot, made the first American flight on September 3, 1945, towed aloft beneath a B-29. Released at 25,000 feet over Chesapeake Bay, Trapnell glided for 8 minutes before igniting the rockets. His post-flight report was devastating. The MXY-7 is fundamentally unstable at high speed. Control forces become excessive above 400 knots. Visibility during powered flight is non-existent due to G-forces and cockpit geometry. The pilot experiences severe physical discomfort during the rocket burn. Precise aiming is impossible. This aircraft represents a waste of industrial capacity. It is dangerous to its pilot and ineffective against its targets. I cannot imagine circumstances under which it would be preferable to a conventional attack. The report concluded, the Oka's sole achievement was to kill its own pilots without meaningful contribution to Japanese war aims. When MacArthur's intelligence teams entered Japanese naval facilities in August and September 1945, they discovered the full scale of the program. Warehouses held 600 undelivered Oka. Factories had jigs for producing 200 more per month. Training manuals outlined expansion plans that would have equipped 10 air groups with the weapon. Documents revealed that Japan had intended to produce 4,000 total Oka for the defense of the home islands. The cost projections were staggering. At 650,000 yen each, 4,000 Oka represented 2.6 billion yen, equivalent to nearly 10% of Japan's entire military budget for 1944. That money could have built 10,000 conventional fighters. It could have produced 200,000 tons of aviation fuel. It could have trained 50,000 pilots to minimum competency standards. Instead, it built a weapon that never worked as intended. American analysts tried to understand the psychology behind the program. How could intelligent, educated engineers and military planners commit such resources to a concept so obviously flawed? The answer lay in the same desperation that produced kamikaze tactics, the belief that conventional methods had failed so completely that any alternative, no matter how radical, deserved consideration. But the Oka represented something deeper than desperation. It represented a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. Japan's military leadership believed that spirit and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage. The willingness to die could compensate for inferior numbers and technology. The Oka was this philosophy reduced to hardware, a machine that traded a pilot's life for the promise of a destroyed enemy ship. The promise was hollow. American ships in 1945 had layered defenses that the Oka couldn't penetrate. Radar pickets detected incoming aircraft 100 miles away. Combat air patrol intercepted threats 50 miles from the fleet. If aircraft penetrated the fighter screen, they faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire from dozens of ships. The 5-inch, 40mm, and 20mm guns created overlapping fields of fire that could put 10,000 rounds per second into the air. Nothing short of overwhelming numbers could get through. And the Oka, paradoxically, reduced the numbers. Each Betty bomber modified to carry the weapon lost its normal bomb load, 1,800 pounds. Each Betty lost was an aircraft that could have made multiple conventional attacks instead of one futile suicide run. Each Oka pilot was a trained aviator who could have flown dozens of sorties in a conventional role. The program consumed resources that could have extended Japan's ability to resist. Instead, it accelerated defeat. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that the Oka did eventually sink a ship. One ship. On April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Manert L. Able was hit by a conventional kamikaze accident. The ship was damaged, but still afloat. Then, while damage control teams fought fires, an Oka appeared. Whether it was aimed at Able or simply happened to hit it will never be known. The pilot, identity unknown, ignited his rockets at high altitude and dove. The weapon struck Able's starboard side below the waterline at an oblique angle. The warhead detonated inside the engineering spaces. The explosion broke the destroyer's keel. Able sank in less than 3 minutes. Japanese propaganda celebrated it as proof that the Oka worked. They didn't mention it was the only success in 74 attempts. They didn't mention the ship was already crippled. They didn't mention that 73 other Oka had achieved nothing except killing their pilots. But even this single success couldn't redeem the program. The cost-benefit analysis was inescapable. Japan had invested enough resources to build 3,400 conventional fighters to develop and produce a weapon that sank one destroyer, a destroyer worth roughly $6 million, approximately 25 million yen. Japan spent 550 million yen to destroy 25 million yen worth of enemy assets, a return on investment of 4.5%. Any other program with that track record would have been canceled immediately. The Oka continued because canceling it would mean admitting the entire concept was wrong, admitting that technological innovation couldn't overcome strategic bankruptcy, admitting that dying with purpose was still just dying. In the decades after the war, Japanese historians struggled with the Oka's legacy. Some portrayed it as a symbol of technical achievement under desperate circumstances. Others saw it as evidence of military leadership divorced from reality, but most simply tried to forget it, embarrassed that Japan's genius for engineering had produced something so ineffective. German engineers who examined captured Oka were baffled. The Luftwaffe had experimented with similar concepts. The Feisler Fe-103R Reichenberg was essentially a piloted V-1 flying bomb. But German engineers abandoned the program after concluding that pilot guidance couldn't improve accuracy enough to justify the loss of trained aircrew. Japan reached the opposite conclusion and committed to mass production. American pilots who encountered Oka remembered it with a mixture of respect and pity. Respect for the courage of pilots willing to die in such a horrific way. Pity that their sacrifice achieved nothing. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, spoke for many when he said in a 1946 interview, "Those Japanese pilots in the Baka bombs were brave men, braver than I could ever be. But bravery without effectiveness is just a waste. They died for nothing. Their leadership failed them." The weapon's name became a cruel joke. Oka, cherry blossom, evoked beauty and transience. Baka, idiot, captured what American servicemen thought of the concept. The weapon meant to inspire fear became an object of mockery. Stories circulated of Oka found intact on beaches, their pilots having survived after engine failures forced them to ditch. The ultimate humiliation for a suicide weapon. Its pilot outliving it. The program's final legacy was documented in post-war interrogations. Vice Admiral Ugaki, who survived the war only to commit suicide on August 15, 1945, left a diary that revealed the military leadership's awareness of the program's failure. His entry for May 15, 1945, 2 weeks before his death, read, "The Oka program is finished. We built a magnificent weapon that couldn't reach its targets. We trained brave men who died without striking back. We consumed resources we didn't have to create something that didn't work. The Americans call it Baka, and they're right. We were idiots. Idiots to believe the spirit could overcome the material. Idiots to think sacrifice without effect had value. Idiots to continue a program that failed from the beginning. History will judge us harshly. We will deserve it." By 1946, American intelligence had compiled a comprehensive assessment of Japanese special attack programs. The Oka received particular attention. The report's conclusion was damning. The MY-XY-7 Oka represents the most extreme example of Japan's technological desperation. Despite impressive engineering in propulsion and structural design, the weapon system failed due to fundamental tactical and strategic flaws. The delivery platform, G4M bomber, could not survive in contested airspace. The weapon's extreme speed made accurate aiming nearly impossible. The industrial resources consumed could have produced 3 to 4 times as many conventional fighters with greater combat effectiveness. Of 74 operational launches, 1 hit was achieved, resulting in the sinking of 1 destroyer. This represents a success rate of 1.4%. By contrast, conventional kamikaze attacks achieved hit rates of approximately 11 to 14% during the same period. The Oka was less effective than the conventional attacks it was designed to replace. The program's most significant impact was negative. Resources diverted from conventional defense, trained pilots wasted, and morale damage when failures became apparent. Had these resources been invested in conventional fighters and defense, Japan's ability to resist would have been marginally extended, though ultimate defeat was inevitable. Assessment. The Oka program exemplifies the danger of pursuing technological solutions to strategic problems. Innovation cannot compensate for overwhelming enemy material superiority. The most poignant evidence of the program's failure came from the pilots themselves. In 2005, historian Emiko Onunuki Tierney
published letters from Oka pilots written before their final missions. The letters revealed men who volunteered out of duty but harbored private doubts about the weapon's effectiveness. One letter, from Ensign Ichiro Hayashi to his family, dated April 28, 1945, the day before his death, was particularly revealing. "Tomorrow I fly in the Oka. They tell us it is a special weapon that will change the war. I want to believe this, but I have seen too many missions return with nothing achieved. The Americans shoot down the motherships before we can launch. Those lucky enough to launch can rarely see their targets through the speed and G-forces. I suspect I will die tomorrow without hitting anything, but I will die trying. That must be enough. Please forgive me for doubting. Please forgive me for failing." Hayashi's Betty bomber was shot down 60 miles from the American fleet. His Oka never launched.
Today, several Oka survive in museums. The Smithsonian has one. The Imperial War Museum in London has another. The Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo displays one as a symbol of sacrifice. Visitors look at these small rocket-powered aircraft and struggle to comprehend the desperation that produced them. The machines are impressive in their way, sleek, purposeful, clearly designed by skilled engineers. But they're also profoundly sad, monuments to failure, evidence of strategic bankruptcy, tombstones for hundreds of young men who died achieving nothing. The technical specifications remain impressive. The rocket motors could accelerate 4,700 pounds to 650 miles per hour in 8 seconds. The warhead was powerful enough to sink a cruiser. The control surfaces could execute 10G turns. But none of it mattered because the weapon couldn't reach its targets. In 1984, test pilot Katsuhiro Maeda, who had survived the war after training on Oka but never flying a combat mission, was asked in an interview what he thought of the weapon. His answer was blunt. "The Oka was a beautiful failure. We built something technically remarkable that was operationally useless. The engineers did their job perfectly. The admirals who ordered it didn't. They gave us an impossible mission and expected miracles. The Americans call it baka, and they're not wrong. But the idiots weren't the pilots who volunteered. The idiots were the generals who built it." The mathematics are inescapable. Japan produced approximately 850 Oka at a total cost of 550 million yen. Add development costs, training facilities, and specialized equipment, and the program likely exceeded 750 million yen, nearly $3 billion in modern currency. This bought Japan one sunk destroyer, worth approximately $6 million in 1945. Compare this to the conventional kamikaze program. Using standard aircraft and volunteer pilots, conventional kamikaze attacks sank 47 ships and damaged 368 more, at a loss of approximately 3,000 aircraft. The Oka program consumed resources equivalent to building 3,400 additional conventional aircraft. If those aircraft had been used in conventional kamikaze attacks instead, historical success rates suggest they would have sunk approximately 47 additional ships and damaged 368 more. Instead, the Oka sunk one ship and damaged none. The most sophisticated analysis came from Operation Bumblebee, a U.S. Navy program studying guided missile technology after the war. Engineers examining captured Oka were struck by how advanced the propulsion system was, in some ways ahead of American rocket technology of 1945. But they also noted the fundamental conceptual flaw. Using a human as a guidance system added weight, complexity, and moral cost without adding precision. The report concluded that an unmanned Oka, radio-controlled or wire-guided, would have been lighter, faster, more accurate, and would not have required sacrificing trained pilots. The radio-controlled technology Japan possessed. They'd experimented with radio-controlled target drones in the 1930s.
But they chose human guidance because they valued the symbolism of sacrifice over the efficiency of automation. This decision encapsulates why Japan lost the war. When faced with choosing between effectiveness and sacrifice, they chose sacrifice. When faced with choosing between resource efficiency and symbolic gestures, they chose gestures. The Oka was a gesture, an expensive, elaborate, technically impressive gesture that achieved nothing. By August 1945, Japan had approximately 600 undelivered Oka stored in warehouses and another 200 in various stages of assembly. Plans existed to produce 4,000 total for the defense of the home islands against invasion. Had the war continued, these weapons would have been launched against the American fleet during Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. American planners had studied the Oka threat and developed countermeasures. The plan called for overwhelming combat air patrol, 300-plus fighters constantly airborne over the fleet. Radar picket destroyers would be positioned 100 miles out to provide maximum warning time. Fighter directors would vector interceptors against any aircraft carrying external stores. The Betty bombers and their Oka loads would have been slaughtered long before reaching launch range. Japanese planning documents captured after the war suggest the military leadership knew this. They knew the weapon wouldn't change the outcome, but they committed to producing 4,000 of them anyway, because doing nothing was psychologically unacceptable. In this sense, the Oka program perfectly represented Japan's strategic situation in 1945, continuing a failed strategy because stopping would require admitting failure, spending resources they didn't have on weapons that didn't work to fight a war they'd already lost. The weapon that was supposed to demonstrate Japanese technological superiority instead demonstrated technological desperation. The humiliation was global. When news of the Baka bomb reached the American press in mid-1945, editorial cartoons portrayed Japanese engineers as delusional madmen building suicide machines. One famous cartoon showed a Japanese officer pointing proudly at an Oka, while American bombers destroyed Japanese cities in the background. The caption, "Our secret weapon will turn the tide." The officer's confident expression contrasted with the burning cities, perfectly capturing the program's disconnect from reality. British observers were particularly harsh. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park commented that the Oka represented the most spectacular waste of resources I've observed in 6 years of war. The Soviets, planning their entry into the Pacific War, studied captured Oka and concluded it represented Japan's desperation, not capability. Even Germany, Japan's ally, privately viewed the program as evidence that Japan was near collapse. The weapon meant to inspire terror became evidence of weakness. The program meant to demonstrate Japanese ingenuity became a showcase for Japanese strategic incompetence. The volunteers who died bravely in Oka achieved nothing except confirming that bravery without support, equipment, and a sound strategy was meaningless.
In the end, the Oka program cost Japan 550+ million yen in direct production costs, 200+ million yen in development and facilities, 3,400 conventional fighters worth of resources that could have extended the war, 300+ aircrew killed delivering weapons that rarely launched, 74 volunteer pilots killed, achieving 1 hit. Incalculable moral damage when failures became apparent. Global humiliation when the weapon's ineffectiveness was revealed. In return, Japan received 1 destroyer sunk, already crippled, 0 other ships damaged, 0 strategic impact, 0 change to war's outcome. The weapon designed to change Japan's fortunes instead became a monument to Japan's defeat. The cherry blossom, meant to symbolize beautiful sacrifice, became the Baka, the idiot bomb. The pilots who volunteered expecting to die honorably instead died pointlessly, victims of their leadership's failure to accept reality. At the Japanese Naval Academy Museum in Etajima, there's a small display about the Oka program. A single example hangs from the ceiling. Below it, a placard provides technical specifications and mentions the bravery of volunteer pilots. But it says nothing about the program's failure, nothing about the wasted resources, nothing about the one hit in 74 attempts. Some failures are too embarrassing to acknowledge, even 80 years later. The Americans had no such reluctance. In 1946, the Strategic Bombing Survey published its assessment of Japanese special attack weapons. The section on the Oka was titled simply, "The Baka Bomb, a Case Study in Desperation." The report clinically documented every failure, every wasted resource, every death without purpose. It concluded, the MXY-7 program serves as a cautionary example of how desperation can drive apparently rational actors to commit vast resources to fundamentally flawed concepts. Commander Frederick Trapnell, the test pilot who flew captured Oka, provided perhaps the most damning assessment in his personal diary, published in 1955. "I flew the Baka bomb today. It was everything the intelligence reports said, fast, unstable, and nearly impossible to control at speed. But more than that, it was sad. You could see in every rivet that Japanese engineers had poured their skill into this thing. The rocket motors were beautifully made. The control surfaces are precisely machined. Someone cared about getting the details right, but all that skill, all that care, went into building a weapon that couldn't work, a weapon that killed its pilots without hitting its targets. Flying it, I felt like I was piloting a very expensive coffin." The Japanese called it cherry blossom, beautiful and brief. They should have called it what it was, a waste. Today, historians debate what Japan should have done instead. The consensus, almost anything else would have been more effective. The resources consumed by Oka could have built 3,400 additional Zero fighters, trained 10,000 additional pilots to basic competency, produced 50,000 tons of aviation fuel, constructed 200 additional airfields, equipped conventional bombers with improved radar and navigation equipment. Any of these alternatives would have extended Japan's ability to resist, even if ultimate defeat remained inevitable. The Oka accelerated defeat while consuming resources that could have delayed it. But the program continued anyway because stopping would require admitting error, because technological innovation had become a substitute for strategy, because the sunk cost fallacy applies to weapons programs as much as any other investment, because sometimes organizations become so committed to failure that success becomes impossible. In April 1943, Japanese engineers believed they could build a weapon that would change the war. By August 1945, they had built 850 weapons that changed nothing. The weapon meant to destroy America's fleet became a laughingstock. The program meant to showcase Japanese innovation became evidence of Japanese desperation. The volunteer pilots who died bravely in Oka achieved nothing except demonstrating that courage without effectiveness is just death. The Americans called it Baka, idiot. They were right. The weapon that was supposed to embarrass America worldwide instead embarrassed Japan. Not through failure to work, the Oka worked exactly as designed, but through success at a task that didn't matter. Building the world's fastest suicide missile was pointless when you couldn't deliver it to the target. Engineering excellence was wasted when applied to a fundamentally flawed concept. 74 Oka were launched in combat. 74 pilots died. 1 destroyer sank. The mathematics of humiliation were complete. Japan had built a technological marvel that killed its own people without harming its enemies, a weapon that showcased Japanese engineering while demonstrating Japanese strategic bankruptcy, a symbol of courage that proved courage alone was insufficient.
The thunder had spoken, but unlike the thunder of the P-47 that buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead, the Oka's thunder was an echo, loud, impressive, and ultimately empty. In the end, the Japanese weapon that backfired horribly wasn't the Oka itself. It was the decision to build it. That decision, to commit vast resources to a flawed concept because alternatives seemed impossible, was the true backfire. The weapon was just evidence. The cherry blossom falls beautifully, but it falls nonetheless. So did Japan, and the Oka, meant to prevent that fall, accelerated it instead. The idiots weren't the pilots. The idiots were those who built them a coffin and called it a sword.